Sanam, after that, it can only be downhill from now on. That was one hell of a build-up. I don't know how one lives up to that, but it's a tremendous honor to be here at NIAC. I hugely admire what you've done. You really have changed hearts and minds inside the United States at an utterly pivotal time, at a last chance time, I think, for all of us. I mean, a really, really pivotal moment. And I'm very excited to be here tonight. I'm also extremely daunted at the prospect of addressing such an impressive group of people who most certainly know more about Iran than I could ever know. My only qualification, as Sanam indicated, is that I have been to Iran very many times, spent months at a time there during the revolution, the hostage crisis, and as she said, the Iran-Iraq war, and more. And I've met and interviewed Presidents Bani Sadr, Khatami, Ahmadinejad several times. He liked being interviewed. And I was very present at Hassan Rouhani's election. And I've set eyes upon, been in the presence of both supreme leaders, Khomeini and Khamenei. I was most recently in Iran a year ago, and I met and interviewed last Tuesday the first Iranian minister to visit the United Kingdom in more than a decade. I speak to you as a journalist, and more particularly as an optimist. So you must offset whatever I say against that background. I know that your ambition in gathering has been to look 10 years ahead to where Iran and American-Iranian relations and Iran's place in the world will be by then. I first arrived in Iran by bus in 1970 as a student, as part of a transcontinental voyage by a number of UK universities, each of whom had put a drama and a band together to take eventually for an exchange with their counterparts in Indian universities, who would then return to the UK. In the week that we were in Iran, we performed concerts at Tabriz and Tehran, and in those days, the Shah was still basking in the aftermath of the millennial celebrations at Persepolis. He was a remote figure whose court and family flaunted ostentatious consumption, but there was no signal to the overthrow of his regime that was to flow 9 years later. But in that moment, I undoubtedly fell in love with the country and with the people, even though I was only there for 1 week going out and 4 days coming back. Of course, the seeds of the revolution, as everyone in this room knows, were largely secular, stirred by the leftist Tudeh party and others. It was in the course of the gathering street demonstrations that the red and white protest banners began to give way to a flood of black-clad Islamists, green flags. Many women, amazing number of women, were very prominent in the revolution, and almost seamlessly it became an Islamic revolution. Protests centered on the Shah's human rights record and on his relationship with the United States. I saw its gory entrails in Sanandaj, in Iranian Kurdistan, torture rooms with blood on the walls and buckets of extracted fingernails in the corner. And then, as now, the country's jails were full of political prisoners. A few days into the revolution, I and my camera crew made it into one of the most sensitive sites in Iran. The country's strategically, what you sort of then saw in what I came to see in those early days, the country's strategic importance to America and to the Western world. And it was well summed up in its huge early warning system on the edge of the Caspian Sea. I'd seen it from our bus back in 1970 on the hilltops at the far end of the coastline of the Caspian Sea. I knew what such a site looked like because I'd grown up in the north of England, close to America's Fylingdale's early warning system that faced the North Sea. From the back of the bus, I had recognized the telltale golf balls and the dishes of this early warning station that were pointed towards Russia's nuclear test site on the other side of the Caspian, sitting there in the Urals, where they did all their missile tests. There was no love lost between Tehran and Moscow in those days. I shall be contrasting how those relationships have been transformed in Syria today, later in my talk. Long before the protests in Tehran's streets had swollen to the many hundreds of thousands, even the millions, the Shah had gone, and gone controversially, ultimately for treatment in a New York hospital. America's embrace of the ailing Shah put the seal on the smashing of relations between Washington and Tehran. But it's worth noticing that in actual fact, America only ever had 20 years of diplomatic relations with Tehran. Contrast that with Britain, who had had up to 300 years of one kind of a relationship or another. Soon, a ragbag collection of students was to make it into the US Embassy, and in those first hours, some of us reporters were able to get in and talk with them and film the 52 blindfolded diplomats. I found no one amongst the students who thought they'd be able to hold out for more than a few hours. On the second or third day, Algeria offered its mediation, but the United States had no relations with Algiers and mistrusted their motives and refused the help. And the rest is history. 444 days later, the hostages were released in a deal brokered by Algeria. For us to look 10 years ahead tonight, we need to recognize that this revolution was very much about America, its support for the Shah, and the extent to which he allowed the country to become a bunkering base for the Cold War. The Russians were invading neighboring Afghanistan in the midst of Iran's turmoil. Indeed, on Boxing Day in 1979, I was in Tehran when the news came through that the Russians were moving into Afghanistan, and I went up to Mashhad because we figured there'd be demos in Mashhad by Afghan students, and we might find somebody who could take us into Afghanistan and take us to the Mujahideen. And amazingly, we found a German-speaking Afghan dental student. We found nobody who spoke English, but we did find this German speaker, and my cameraman had done national service in the British Army and had had to learn German. So we were able to communicate with him, and he led us over the border, and we were passed from hand to hand to various mullahs along the way, to the point at which we were with the Mujh. And the Mujh were armed with old Lee Enfield guns that had been made for the First World War. And they were no match for the Soviets. But it was in those days that it was the first time I'd ever seen evidence of suicide bombing. Kids were climbing onto the tanks and jumping into the open doors on the tops of the tanks and detonating the crews inside. In those days, at the same time, if you took off from Mehabad Airport in Tehran, you could look down on the contiguous airbase, where row upon row of refueling tankers and troop carriers, 747s, were drawn up in lines below. Dozens of freshly delivered armored personnel carriers, tanks, and the rest sat beyond. They were far, far more than Iran could ever have used for its own purposes, and it was clear that this was the bunkering yard for America's standoff with the United States, with Russia. And it was quite clear that the interest in the Iranian people was infinitely secondary to the issues of strategic balance with Moscow. The common cry on the streets of Tehran was Magba Carter, Magba Shah, in that order. Death to Carter, death to Shah. I was mystified by graffiti painted on a wall outside the US Embassy. Crater is a dag and a donkey, it read, until someone explained it's supposed to say Carter is a dog and a donkey. Poor Jimmy Carter, certainly in post-presidential times, undoubtedly one of the finest Americans alive. And pray God he stays that way in his 90s. And we all wish him well. I've read that cancer moves very slowly by the time you get to 90. So I think he's still got a bit going. I had the pleasure of interviewing him in the Royal Festival Hall in London a few years back, about 3 or 4 years ago, and he was utterly brilliant and held an audience of 3,500, absolutely spellbound. And the average age of that audience, I would say, was about 28. Young people wanted to hear him. But the one area when I quizzed him, because it was a discussion that we held on the platform, the only area that he didn't really venture into was what had happened in Iran at the end of his presidency, and who can blame him? But I remember how much the students wanted, those students in the embassy wanted but never had direct dialogue with Washington. There was no attempt whatever to engage them. There was America just said this was a heinous crime, the seizing of diplomats, and so it was. But this was a very brittle revolutionary situation, and there was no attempt whatever to try to diffuse it by talking to them, by trying to work out what kind of a deal could be done. And so we landed where we were. And it was really the beginning of a downward cascade, which was to take us where we were until the signing of this deal. I had by now been lent to ABC television in New York, whose American personnel, like everyone else from America, had been expelled. New York called me one day to say that Secretary of State Cyrus Vance was willing to talk with his Iranian opposite number, Sadek Gopzadeh, or Gotburzadeh, as the Americans called him, Gotburzadeh, on Ted Koppel's late-night show. I beetled along to Gotburzadeh's ministerial office. We were on familiar terms by then. I knocked on the door and walked in. Sadek, I said, Cy Vance wants to talk to you on Ted Koppel's show. Where? When? He said. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't wait. I said, well, it's going to be 4 o'clock in the morning. I said, on Iranian television. We can do it up at their studios. And he jumped at the idea. And despite the fact that the program opened with a drum roll heralded by a booming American voice that declared, Iran in crisis, America held hostage. But that, so far as I'm aware, was the only direct encounter at that level at any time in the period that the hostages were held. Soon we were in the midst of the 8-year-long Iran-Iraq war, as Saddam Hussein joined the effort to roll back the Islamic Revolution. To stand as a reporter in that war, as I did, was to stand in the midst of hell. We had no flak jackets and only rudimentary gas masks. There were vast artillery barrages, followed by huge explosions right in front of us, an APC belching flames, horribly burned troops stumbling out onto the ground, wave upon wave of young conscripts pouring over the ramparts only to be cut down by machine gun fire, or to be wiped out by Saddam's infernal mustard gas. This ghastly conflict lasted 8 years. East and West armed both sides at various times. 1 million men and boys died in a war front that never moved more than a mile in all those years. And so the stage was set for Iran's isolation. A moment of a reformist Iranian government dawned with the election of President Khatami, whose slender political openings were never grasped by the West, and then Iran slipped back again to the rhetoric and behavior that had so scared the West during the days of revolution. Ahmadinejad's 2 terms as president facilitated all those who saw in Iran the personification of evil. What is incredible about Iran is that it has been so demonized that when you talk to people about loving Iran, about going there, about traveling there, about being in a place like Isfahan or in Tehran or in Shiraz or somewhere near the poet's tomb, they think you're completely barking. These are very dangerous people. These are people who are a threat to world peace. These are people who have to be dealt with, and America is absolutely right to stand up to them. They had absolutely no inkling of the life that existed and continued to run beneath whatever was going on in the international community and at the upper levels of the administration in either Iran or in America. And that has been the consistent thread all the time I'm being there. Of course, many of your families left in those very early years for very understandable reasons. But the fact is that many stayed, and many continued to live lives, fulfilled lives, difficult lives, but continued to hold true to what they knew to be the potential of a very great country. Ahmadinejad's notorious denial of the Holocaust disguised the fascinating reality that Iran is home to the largest Jewish population in the Middle East outside Israel, some 40,000 people. That for years, that community has been represented in Parliament by the ebullient Siamak Morasheh, the director of Tehran's Jewish hospital, a facility 98% of whose patients are Muslim. And beneath the rhetoric, the fist-shaking and the name-calling, the burgeoning concern that Iran's sophisticated scientific capacity was being turned to making more than nuclear power, in short, a bomb. Like everyone else, I have no idea what their eventual intent was, nor how far they got. But this became the rod with which the U.S. and her allies could subject the regime to endless beatings. Forget non-signatories Israel, India, and Pakistan. Any whiff that Iran might be doing it, despite signing the NPT, was beyond the pale. But I tell you this, back in 2007, I was in the foreign ministry in Tehran, and I asked the top civil servant there in the Iranian Foreign Office, in terms of defense, which was Iran most afraid of in terms of those who might bomb Tehran? Was it going to be Israel or America? Neither, he retorted instantly. It's Pakistan, nuclear Sunni Pakistan, whose radicalization down the years by Saudi Wahhabis is all but complete. Indeed, we cannot these days be certain that Pakistan's bomb is not to some extent a Saudi proxy bomb. Finally, my friend added, sheer Tehran would be their first target. As we all know, the talks designed to deal with any Iranian nuclear threat were to drag on for years until the sublime, if disjointed, breakthrough. The election of former nuclear negotiator Hassan Rouhani as Iran's president 4 years after Barack Obama had fractured America's 3 decades of hostility by extending the open hand of friendship to Iran during that momentous speech in Cairo in 2009. Obama's speech had been sheer music to many of the beleaguered Iranians. I confess I saw in it a rare and very direct link with the Barack Obama who, without the cares of presidency, revealed himself in his exceptional book, Dreams from My Father. It was music to the people of Iran because, in truth, very many of them look west. Iran does not look east. They pine for what we have: connectivity, travel, commerce, science, art, life. 6,000 years of civilization does not fall away easily, and in Iran it has not. It stands tall amongst its neighbors and is fascinatingly different from the Arab Sunni world that almost surrounds it. Sure, it can foster a kind of arrogance, and why not? Persians were writing alphabets and numbers when most of us in the West were still on our bellies in caves. But that's a fact. And this is the core of the great hope that I, for one, foster for Iran's future and her place in the world, but is one that mystifies me. Clearly, when Vanessa Bell, Lawrence of Arabia, and the others sought effectively to draw borders, influence, tame, perhaps even colonize Arabia, not least because of the burgeoning importance of her oil, Iran would perhaps have been a trickier prospect, as BP was to discover. But in the long term, Iran is, to my mind, a far more natural ally to the West than ever the Saudis can be. I was intrigued back in 2006 when Britain was at the forefront of drawing up ever more draconian sanctions against Iran at the United Nations, to be chatting with the then British Prime Minister Tony Blair. I had just done a formal interview with him in Egypt. It was about the tsunami in which about 120 Brits had died, amongst the many thousands of others who died. As it happened to be New Year's Day, he asked me what I was worried about in the coming year. I said, I'm not worried about anything. I'm only worried about what you're worried about. He said, well, and this is extraordinary in 2006, well, we're very worried about the Saudis. I thought that was an extraordinary statement. Perhaps flippantly, I said, well, we're always worried about the Saudis, but it won't happen this year, will it? He agreed, and I added, so what about Iran? And perhaps too fast, I suggested, of course, it all goes back to Mossadegh, doesn't it? And he said, John, you're going to have to remind me. It beggars belief that at such a moment, a British Prime Minister had no idea of what we had done to Iran's last democratically elected Prime Minister, whom we, that is America and Britain, had overthrown in 1953. Yet had he been briefed on any side of A4, probably paragraph 2 would have stated that any British Prime Minister dealing with Iran needs to know exactly what we did and why Iranians resent it. I still wonder if on that day George W. Bush knew either. Indeed, there are times when I actually, and I mean this, I wonder whether either of them had any real awareness of the profound differences between Sunni and Shia Islam. This lack of history in a region so trampled upon by Westerners, the prolonged failure to engage with Iran, and instead the huge investment in trying to batter down her pride and capacity with the worst sanctions regime ever meted out against any country, has today left its own dangerous legacy. If you kill off legal international banking transactions, you will know that a major oil-producing entity will find ways to develop alternative black market systems. And this has happened, as you all know, on a vast scale. Turkey and Abu Dhabi, among others, became the massive sifting centers for Iran's international transactions. The monies gushing through these systems amounted to hundreds of billions over the years. The enriching of the Revolutionary Guard, the twisting of their purpose, poses real risks to the emergence of Iran from this 35-year nightmare. Their men are in the field in Syria and Iraq, ironically the most effective forces against the rise of terror forces of the Islamic State. Some of their generals have been killed in the effort. The extent to which the Revolutionary Guard can be harnessed for peace is still quite an open question. Last year in Tehran, together with our guide from the Ministry of Guidance, we were arrested by the Revolutionary Guard for filming at a pharmacy, which could no longer purchase high-end cancer drugs thanks to the international transactions sanction. They decided that we were going to report the successful effect of sanctions. We were doing nothing of the sort. We were trying to illustrate that you could say you had no sanctions against pharmaceuticals, but in actual fact, if you had a sanction against international banking transactions, you obviously couldn't buy high-end pharmaceuticals. And that was something these people never understood. You couldn't have these sanctions and not, in the end, smash up absolutely every element and leave the way open to corrupt business being conducted through some other channels. Fortunately for us, the police turned up and managed somehow to arrest us from the clutches of the guards. They told us that if the guards had taken us, we could have been in custody for 3 weeks. In the event, we were in a police custody, chatting and drinking tea for about 3 hours. In the holy city of Qom last year, we met many mullahs in the colleges clustered around the Jamkaran Mosque, a small but animated number of whom spoke quite openly of the need to get the church out of running the state. On so many fronts, I hardly need tell you that the dynamics in Iran are absolutely fascinating. Women outnumber men at the country's universities 60-40. People of all, I'm telling you everything you know, you just want to wallow in it, that's all. People of all conditions talk surprisingly easily on the street. This is an educated, motivated, intelligent society. We have added to its wastage for 3 decades. Too many of us allowed the US to do the non-talking. The cost to Europe has been enormous. Before the sanctions, the European Union was Iran's biggest trading partner by a long way. Today, we are her 6th. When I was in Tehran a year ago, the hotels were already full of European delegations looking to do business with this vast entity. Germans, Belgians, Swiss, French, but few Brits and no Americans. Today, the numbers are even greater, and the nuclear deal is still in its infancy. But there is a bursting yearning by huge numbers of people to trade with Iran and become involved in her recovery. Last Tuesday, I met with Hossein Amir Abdullahian, Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister. When I asked about the nature of Iran's relationship with Russia, not least in Syria, he replied, "It is durable and continuous." Contrast that with how I described Tehran's relationship with Moscow at the time of the revolution. It's an amazing feat. The international community has played its part in shifting the tectonic plates to a point at which you now have Russian and Iranian forces in the field as allies. So looking 10 years ahead, can we rule out a caliphate in part of Syria and part of Iraq? My guess is that Iran will use all its powers to prevent the erosion of the Shia regions in Iraq and the Alawite region in Syria. Iran will remain relatively stable. External investment will gradually rebuild her economy, together with the liberation of the pent-up intellectual, scientific, and industrial capacity inside the country. The European Union and individual European countries will work hard to restore their fortunes and influence with Iran. The British will be amongst the slower of the EU member states, but they will achieve, providing they remain inside the EU, which is the thing we worry about at the moment. The tension and gathering instability inside Saudi Arabia will lead to the strengthening of Iran's position in the region. But at the same time, the wayward Islamist forces unleashed in the Arabian Peninsula will test Iran's defenses keenly. This in itself may lead to Iran reducing its activities associated with Lebanon, Palestine, and Israel. having to safeguard matters closer to home. I believe that despite the strength of the hardliners, the reformists will sustain, thanks to the change in economic circumstances. But the lifting of sanctions needs to bear tangible and speedy fruit. There is even a chance, I suppose, that the next Supreme Leader may himself be more reformist-minded. I did hear word of the candidates that are talked about in GOM, and one or two of them are regarded as quite interesting figures. But the 35-year-long fear within the revolution of compromise, of overthrow, is real and has led the regime to match the Shah's record on human rights. Detention and execution abound. Yet on the other side, there is enlightenment in treating the historic and massive drug problem in Iran, talk recently even of following Uruguay's lead in legalization of both cannabis and opium. Their treatment of addicts is very interesting to observe and remarkably humane. And it has been an abiding problem in Iran for a very long time. As for Iran's place in the world, it's hard indeed to see how quickly U.S. Iranian trade and influence can be repaired or can recover anytime soon. When I spoke to the Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister in London last Tuesday, he told me that Iran will only discuss bilateral matters with America, that there is no question of discussing regional matters, perhaps born out of the absence of Iran at John Kerry's Vienna talks on Syria on Friday. At the same time, Mr. Abdullahian spoke warmly of the EU, with who they see as agents of much of the diplomatic effort that has led us to this point, despite obviously the fact that John Kerry deserves huge personal gratitude for what he's done. There will indeed be trade and opening up. The EU will indeed, I think, honour the interest that Iran has in going forward with them. They have a very warm feeling towards Cathy Ashton, who was a very clever chair of those talks for all those years, and I think she deserves terrific credit too. I suspect that for the United States, by far the most likely route to rapprochement will lie in the cultural sphere. In this, I can offer a concluding story of both hope and encouragement. In the dark days of 2008-9, the British Museum managed to borrow critical ancient Persian artifacts from Tehran for two huge exhibitions in London, one most famously centered on Shah Abbas. In that moment, Anglo-Iranian diplomatic relations were beyond cold storage. They were possibly as fossilized as diplomatic relations can be. Yet the exchange of artifacts bloomed in the margins between the civil societies of the two countries. Then, in 2010, Iran asked the British Museum for the loan of perhaps the most treasured Persian artifact in Western hands, the Saras cylinder. The British Foreign Office was adamant it must not go. Tehran will never give it back. They told the museum it should not be lent. The trustees of the British Museum decided that they had an overwhelming moral responsibility to lend it. So it went. Then a week or two before it was due to come back, the trustees received an alarming email asking if the cylinder could remain just a few weeks longer until Nowruz. The trustees had no option but to agree, but hearts were beginning to sink. There was a mood of, I told you so, at the Foreign Office. But 2 days after Nowruz, Neil McGregor, the wonderful director of the British Museum, called me up. Be in the Persian Gallery at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning with your camera crew, he said. On the dot of 8, the double doors of the gallery opened, and in walked a man in white gloves bearing a steel box lined in polystyrene. And in that moment, I knew my love and belief in Iran had been rewarded, because the man in the white gloves opened it gently and lifted the little cylinder out, placing it back in its glass cabinet. He closed the door and turned the key. The art of the possible is alive and well in Iran. I did warn you, I am an optimist. I'll get shot. That's the end of my career.
No, on the contrary, I think your career just took off. Now, how do you follow that up? Can anyone hear me? How does one follow that up with an enlightening Q&A? That was absolutely amazing and breathtaking. Thank you so much, Jon Snow. Not just for being here, not just for giving this amazing, amazing address, but because throughout 3.5 decades of darkness, you never lost faith in the friendship that the Iranian people could return to you. Yeah. Never lost faith that despite all of these politics, there are people on both sides, and that cannot be forgotten, and that we constantly have to apply ourselves over and over again until the impossible becomes the possible. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, it is I who must thank you, who made me sit down and write my thoughts down, and I'm really pleased I have. And I agree with what I've said.
Now, you mentioned that you're an optimist, so I'm going to take you up on that, because we in this room, and I want to give credit, there's so many different organizations that have been part of the effort of getting this Iran deal. I know many of them are here tonight. I know the J Street folks are here. We have Win Without War. We have Code Pink. We have the Arms Control Associations. I want to give a round of applause for all of them. For all FCNL, Plowshares, all of them have done such an amazing effort to get to this point. But one thing that has frankly dampened the celebrations a little bit, this is an amazing achievement, but it's been dampened by the fact that almost everything else in the region is going in the wrong direction. It's a little bit difficult to be all jolly on this issue when you see what's going on in Syria, when you see what's going on in Iraq and in Yemen, and of course now again in Israel and Palestine. I know I'm putting you on the spot, but you give so many tough interviews, so you should be okay. Give us your estimation, your prediction of where things will be in the region a decade from now, with Saudi Arabia, with Iran, what is happening in Israel, Palestine, Gaza, Yemen. Can you be an optimist there as well?
I mean, there are so many uncertainties. I mean, we don't know what's going on in Saudi Arabia, but this extraordinary talk of a prince trying to get the king to step down, and the really wholesale export of radicals who are proving a bit of a problem inside the kingdom. Many of them are joining ISIS. I mean, there are large numbers now of Saudis on the ground. Yemen, I can't see anything being done unless some third party, well, the time was when you might look to the UN, but some third party will intervene and say, come on, we must stop this. And then there would have to be international pressure on Saudi Arabia to stop bombing. The Israel-Palestine thing, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Barack Obama, but I'm disappointed in one thing, and that is that he didn't hold the line on settlements. He gave them an order. He said they must stop. And I think everybody in the world thought that's right. But in some way, he didn't feel he could hold the line at home, and he let it go. But for a moment, he said they must stop. And then it didn't last more than a couple of weeks. So I don't see any breakthrough on that front at all. And it's an extraordinary thing that the world lets it go on. I've been to Gaza a lot in the last couple of years, and it's amazing that there is an entity in the world that is in the state that Gaza is in, and we do absolutely nothing about it, except, of course, the amazing aid agencies who are keeping the people alive. No, it's not a pretty picture, but on the other hand, you've also got to remember that Iran has never pushed out into anybody else's territory.
And therefore, I think the integrity of the country will be well defended. And you don't, when you're in Iran, you don't feel the insecurity that's going on elsewhere. You feel the thing is all pretty robust, you know. So I am optimistic that in all that mayhem, the one country that is, you know, clearly there are tensions. There are bound to be. I mean, you know, there are people who are unhappy with the regime. There are other people in the regime who are doing an amazing job. So, you know, I mean, Zarif has done an absolutely unbelievable job. And Iranchi too, I mean, amazing. And one must pay credit to Rouhani, who's played a very clever balancing act between the supreme leader and the rest. I'm optimistic that Iran will prevail as a productive and advancing entity.
You've seen so many of the episodes in Iran when things have gone well, when things have gone really bad. And you have, at the same time, had the opportunity, and I have to say, part of the reason why we wanted you to be here today is because the courage you've shown in the questions you ask, in the journalism that you do, that frankly, I really wish we had a little bit more over here in making sure that some tough questions were asked. Your interview with Mark Rege, your interview just 2 weeks ago with David Cameron, the interview you did with Ahmadinejad in which you question him on the unjust imprisonment of Maziar Bahari, who incidentally is somewhere in this room. You challenged him. But right now...
Well, no, you make it sound very courageous, but to be honest, they just are the thoughts that come into my head when I'm doing it, you know. I mean, I don't say, I've got to be courageous here, come on. You know, it's...
But you've seen these things, and courageous or not, rest assured those questions are not that often asked on this side, unfortunately. But where do you think things will go inside of Iran then? Because right now we are seeing more unjust imprisonments. We're seeing a backlash. We're seeing, frankly, Iranian Americans being targeted in a way that actually is somewhat of a new phenomenon on a larger scale. Do you think that this will lead to a situation in which this up and down actually will start to get a direction? Yes, it may go up and down, but overall it's going in the right direction.
Well, I think the very fact that the deal's got this far, you know, is itself an amazing thing, viewed from both sides, but viewed from Tehran and viewed from Washington, as one must view it from Washington. And yeah, I think there is retrenching going on, and it's being very well chronicled by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. Unfortunately, Iran has never had a good record in our lifetime on human rights, and far too many people have been locked up, far too many people have been executed. I think until things stabilize and the balance of fear about change is balanced by economic improvement, dramatic economic improvement, it's going to be a risky period. This is the dawn light before the sun comes up. You know, we've had the promise of the sun, you know, and it's getting lighter, but it's still dark. And this is where everybody has to hold their nerve. And I hope everybody will. I think the key figures in Iran are holding their nerve. The key figures outside Iran are certainly holding their nerve. And we must just, there's not much we can do other than hope. But also, I think critically, ensure every step of the way that everything possible can be done to make it feel as if things are moving, and moving in a way that ordinary Iranians and even those who might have opposed the deal from within Iran can see change with which they can live and possibly prosper.
I don't want to monopolize the conversation. I'm going to take one or two questions from the audience. I just want to let everyone know, Mr. Snow has been so kind to fly out
John,
here.
only the police call me Mr. Snow.
Okay.
Right.
John has been so kind to fly out here. His flight back to London is just in a couple of hours.
No, it's not that bad. It's at 11:30.
11 o'clock, I think.
11:30, yeah.
11:30, yeah. And we definitely don't want to be in the risk zone there. So I'm going to take 1 or 2 questions. And for all of those who have been here throughout the day, I'm going to repeat it. Questions, not comments, speeches, or anything else. I have a hard time seeing hands. Okay, over there I see a hand. If you could wait for the microphone.
First, I'd like to thank you. First, I'd like to thank you for coming up to our event. It's been an honor to having you. My main question for you is, out of all the interviews you've done in your career, what has been the most memorable and the most fascinating interview that you have ever done?
Well, it's going to sound a very hackneyed answer, but I'm afraid it was talking to Mandela when he, after he had come out. And I think anybody who suffers what he suffered and comes out and talks about forgiveness but not forgetting, which is a very, very important coupling, is somebody who takes you back to your roots and you really think very hard about life. But also, the brilliant thing about him was he'd only ever once been interviewed before, just 27 years earlier by somebody just before he got picked up and thrown into jail. So he hadn't ever been processed. And so the alarming thing was that if you asked him a question, he actually answered it. Now, most people, if you ask them a question, give you a completely alien answer, which had nothing whatever to do. And that, in a way, was the beauty of the Saudi thing with Cameron. There was nothing he could draw on to sort of get out of it. You know what I mean? It was very interesting. Yeah. So I'm afraid Mandela, without any challenge, though possibly Gorbachev too, although it's very different when you don't actually speak the same language. Although he had a wonderful translator who was extremely instant. So you could get quite a rapport going.
Anything on this end? Go ahead.
You're so far away. I'll be right over. So sorry.
There's a lot of hands in that far corner too.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Snow. If there's one aspect of Iranian culture that you would like to see brought and transferred over to the West, what would it be?
Well, obviously food, but quite a lot of it's got. But I mean, they're a very beautiful race. I mean, that is also another thing. They certainly are beautiful. That's very important.
Are you running for office or anything?
Not yet.
I think we have time for one more
forest
question.
Over there. Okay,
yeah.
Let's get both those guys.
Okay, very good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Can you stand?
Thank you for the great speech, Mr. Snow. You asked Prime Minister David Cameron why the United Kingdom has the full-fledged support and gives the support for Saudi Arabia for them to be on the Human Rights Council. And he really didn't give you a good answer. He was just like, it's how it is, it's what we got to do. So I want your opinion. Why do you think the United Kingdom and even the United States gives their full-fledged support to Saudi Arabia when there's so many human rights violations, so much support of radical groups in the Middle East, and you see on the other side with Iran, they completely vocalize their opposition to every single thing that Iran does. Compared to Saudi Arabia, they're silent.
Well, I think they just made the wrong decision. I mean, I think they threw everything in with the Saudis without ever really understanding, what they were doing. I mean, and of course, oil was a huge driver. I mean, fracking has obviously reduced that for the United States, but for the rest of us, a lot of us are still very dependent on Saudi oil. There is an interesting film, not a terribly good film, but a very interesting film. I don't know if that's possible, but it seems to be. Made by Adam Curtis of the BBC, which is called something Lake. What's it called? Anyway, you don't need it. The point about it is it talks about the deal that was done between the Saudi king and Roosevelt in the lake that's in the Suez Canal. They met on a destroyer at the end of the Second World War. And the deal was that the Saudi Arabian king said, you will always have all the oil you want, providing you pay for it. But in return, and we will never ever let you down on that front. But in return, firstly, we will need weapons. And secondly, we want non-interference either with the religious practice that goes on in the kingdom or with any of our internal affairs. And I think that that deal pertains to this day, because it still surprises me very considerably that we've never really got to the root of how it was that there were these 17 Saudi hijackers involved in 9/11 and where the buck stopped. I mean, you know, we can say it was Osama bin Laden. What was Osama bin Laden's relationship to the Wahhabi radical forces that were in play in Saudi Arabia? And what, in turn, was the relationship of any elements of the royal family to that part of life? I don't know, something we just don't know.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, actually, Matthew,
There's
you want
one more here.
Okay, I just want to make sure you don't miss your flight.
Personal history with us. My question has to do with a comment you made about the role of the United States and Britain in the overthrow of Mohammed Mossadegh in 1953. You mentioned how, you know, the international community let the United States get away without talking to Iran for so long, and the talks were always missed opportunities. And I wanted to ask you about Britain's role in that overthrow of the Iranian government and the consequences it had in terms of the political development of Iran. Currently, there's a movement to disclose more information about that chapter of U.S. British history, but it seems to me that the British government is more reluctant than the American government to disclose that.
Well, it's more
history.
embarrassing for the British government because we didn't actually manage to stay the course. We got thrown out the night before, and old Kermit Roosevelt had to do it on his own. And of course, it was all sort of smoke and mirrors anyway, because they pretended they'd got a much bigger, capacity to overthrow Mossadegh than they really had. I mean, I'm not a historian. I've been to Mossadegh's house. I went there for his, I don't know what the anniversary was. It must have been his 100th, must have been the 100th birthday or something like that. I mean, obviously he'd been dead, but there was a huge gathering and lots of old characters who'd been ministers in his government. But I didn't really learn that much from them. I don't think they knew any more than I did. But the whole Kermit Roosevelt enterprise seems to be a bit of a cowboy job. And I don't know to what extent it really was an official American decision to overthrow Mossadegh. I mean, Mossadegh, the real crime he committed was to take over the oil company, which of course was not a crime. It was certainly in the interests of Iran that he should do so. But I don't think it's really worth trawling back over it really, because I don't think it tells us much about today. The main thing is to try and ensure that these players now play on instead of blowing the whistle and walking away.
Okay. Please join me, everyone, thanking Jon Snow for everything you have done, for coming here, asking the tough questions, and seeking the truth. Thank you so much.
Thank you.